Okay, hello everyone and welcome to episode 4 of our Playing Like Pulis save. Now, if I seem a bit quieter than usual, it's because it is 11 PM that I'm recording this video on the 9th of November, on my birthday. So as you can imagine, I've not really had much time to get round to actually recording this video, but that's the level of dedication you're getting from me at the moment. So hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and yeah, let's get this show on the road. So we're going to start off with taking a look at our pre-season results, take a look at the goals, discuss them as they happen, and obviously you guys at home will get a very rough idea of the types of goals that should hopefully be coming from this tactic. Now, the tactic has changed quite significantly. No, I'm just kidding. To be fair, some people might think the changes are relatively significant. I don't really think they are. It's just been small tweaks here and there, but the core concept of the tactic that we'll be entering the first game of the Premier League against holding champions Chelsea will be very similar to what we discussed in an earlier video, and the core concepts of the player roles remain the same. Changes that will have occurred are simply down to how the match engine plays out and how I've seen my players fit into certain roles and how they've played in different roles throughout pre-season. So without further ado, let's take a look at our goals during pre-season, and then we'll go and take a look at how our tactics have changed. Okay, so as you guys can see, we started things off with the kind of traditional game against our reserves, and let's be fully honest, it's always kind of a positive when you don't lose to your under 23s. That's kind of like, if it's your first game in the job and you lose to your under 23s, that's kind of when you know, nah, this ain't the game for me, this ain't the job for me. But as you can see, obviously this was the tactic that we created in the second episode. This is the first game of pre-season, so I'd not really been able to watch a full game by this point or tweak stuff. We saw some tweaks come in the second half, but generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that from most of our goals throughout pre-season, you'll get quite a rough idea with regards to how we're going to be looking to play, how direct our play style is going to be. You can see some of the long balls already that we've seen from both the first half and the second half, and there you have it. Long ball from our central midfielder out wide to the winger, and that was how we scored our second goal after he whips it into the box. So this early on, signs of a Pulis-esque dynamic coming along. Next up, after further tweaking, was a game at home against Anderlecht. Now you might think Anderlecht, well, you know, you're a Premier League side, and if you look at the left-hand side, our stats really aren't that impressive. But what I am going to say is when you do come up against sides, let's not forget that Anderlecht are a team that still play European football, right? So when you come up against sides, especially like Anderlecht, that are set up with five in midfield, that are set up to play possession-style football, we are always going to not have the majority of the possession. We are probably not going to have the majority of the shots on target. But a lot of the time, when you see our opposition with our defensive approach, trying to play the Pulis way, when they have loads of chances at goal, most of their shots will actually be from outside of the area, regardless of whether they're on target or off target. So for me, playing the Pulis way, as you can see, you can talk about Guardiola, you know, 200 passes and whatnot to the goal. All it took from us there was to win the ball back in midfield, long ball forward to Murray, I think it was, or Izquierdo, and then the goal went in. And then we were quite unfortunate to concede this sloppy goal, but obviously players are still really unfit and loads of subs kind of get made late on in pre-season games. But generally speaking, based off the two games we've seen so far, correct me if I'm incorrect, but I think we've seen glimpses of, again, playing the Pulis way. And I think if you ask me what's more important as well, or just as important, isn't just playing the Pulis way, but also managing to grind out wins. Now I know Crawley are a team, as a Premier League side, we should kind of be walking but it was still pre-season. You're still waiting for players to gain fitness, and you're still tweaking as you go along, and your tactical familiarity ain't on point. So for example, if we take a look at the overall stats for this game, if I can figure out where to find them, yeah, what have they done with this user interface? Obviously, this was probably, well, not probably, it was the first time we faced a 5 at the back formation, using our tactical approach at the time. And I say at the time, even though our current one isn't that different, obviously it was whatever we had tweaked at that point in time throughout pre-season. 17 off-target shots, and the strikers were basically taking a ridiculous number of shots from outside of the area. And it was very difficult for us to break and cross the ball into the area because they played with 3 centre-backs for obvious reasons. And, you know, just little things like that. Yeah, sure, our only goal came from a corner, but we kept another clean sheet. We looked pretty solid, pretty dominant. We made a lot of chances. But at the same time, it gave us just a little bit of food for thought to carry on tweaking and just try and find the winning formula, really. Next up, as you can see, was a pretty damn big scoreline. And if we look at our stats, even though obviously this team are perhaps slightly worse than Crawley, generally speaking, you could tell that the tweaks we made resulted in a lot less shots off target, right? It's that simple, and that's what pre-season is about. So as you can see, Vucinic was playing. It was a bit of a funny own goal, and Mirko Vucinic, obviously you might remember him from his days at Roma and Juventus. I think Juventus, pretty sure. Yeah, so he's a free agent on the game, and obviously not the transfer window, but all teams have absolutely no money to spend. There we go, big direct ball forward, early cross from March, playing the Pulis way, and yeah, his physicals are alright. He's previously playing in the United Arab Emirates, and it kind of felt like it would have been a decent transfer, because I am still allowing myself to make free transfers in this first transfer window where teams have no money to spend. But unfortunately, because he was Montenegrin, and we agreed, that was a lovely goal, that, by the way, and that's just what Vucinic gives you, that extra bit of pace up front, and then fantastic. There's another corner goal. Fantastic technical ability to whip that ball in towards Tom Mohamed. But yeah, so we managed to agree terms with Mirko Vucinic, and he wanted to sign, but unfortunately, because he's Montenegrin, they just wouldn't give us a work permit for him. Glenn Murray comes on off the bench and bags our final goal of the game and celebrates by himself in the corner. But yeah, so Vucinic isn't going to be a thing. We also brought in some other players on trial who we'll take a look at in a bit, but unfortunately we haven't ended up signing any of them, which does mean it looks very, very likely that we're basically not even going to make any loan or free signings. Now, one thing I found really, really interesting is how significant morale and the team dynamics really seem to be to the game this year. And I'm not going to lie, when they first came out, I kind of thought they were going to be another gimmick, but I've been proven wrong given how much I've played so far. Now, obviously, I've only played pre-season, but the lines that come up on the tactics screen, I have certainly noticed that players that have lines between them genuinely do have better understanding between each other. You'll just find that, you know, you're keeping more possession, your players are playing better. That's a nice goal there as well. You see the fullbacks just about getting involved, not pushing up too much. And this is a nice goal as well from a free kick. And again, it's very Pulis-esque, you know, we're getting good goals from set pieces. But yeah, which is why it was important for me to rotate players throughout pre-season, because we'll actually take a look at it now before taking a look at some of our other results. If you go to the dynamics page, obviously it is a Sunday League reputation manager. I think I'm going to have a lot of trouble anyways throughout this save, because the players don't want me here. They never even heard of me, and my managerial support is very, very poor. So we're going to have to start getting some solid draws and solid wins, which we hopefully will do. Maybe not against Chelsea, but in some of the games after that, to try and, you know, just hope they don't force me out the club. Dressing room atmosphere in general is something that can keep pretty good. Team talks are a lot harder this year, especially on a Sunday League reputation, but as you can see, we're doing alright, we're not doing too badly, and match cohesion, I believe, is really where the magic kicks in terms of these lines and your dynamics and whatnot. And I genuinely did find that, for example, when players had lines between them, they did perform a lot better. And it's important going into the season that as many of our pairings as possible are used to playing each other and have time playing together. That way, when we make a substitution or an injury happens, we don't have to wait a game or two for certain partnerships to familiarise themselves with each other and just improve that overall cohesion, because I really did feel like it made a difference personally. Now, as we can see on the left hand side of the screen, we're kind of playing against Jiangsu, and this was probably the most disappointing result of our entire pre-season. I'm not really quite sure how they dominated us so much. We struggled against them. And like I said before, even though we're kind of expecting not to have a lot of possession, even though we're kind of expecting to... This was a really disappointing goal to concede. Even though we're kind of expecting to hit a lot of teams on the break, I feel like as a Premier League side, we really should have done better against a Chinese or Japanese side. I mean, it goes to say a lot about them when I don't even know where they're from. And it's disappointing as well because both types of goals that were conceded were very, very similar. And I think it may have been the first time that Bong had played at left back, and it certainly showed. But what was positive as well, that we got another goal from a set piece. So it just goes to show that we have the players to really make a difference from that side of things. But again, I'd say this was really the main disappointing game of pre-season. I'm looking pretty nice in my blue coat, to be fair, on the bench. It's kind of disappointing you can no longer click on yourself and see your name. I only just discovered that. But like I said, it was pre-season and there were tweaks made this match, and it was kind of obvious that certain tweaks may not have been as effective as others. So that previous game, we played quite a heavily rotated side. Funnily enough, some of our main players come in, especially in the form of Suttner, and he's gotten 2 assists already. So great set piece deliveries from him and great goals from him. Bong, the secondary left back, was a person that was really causing us problems in that last game, and the second Suttner is placed back in the side, we get 2 goals thanks to his set pieces. And yeah, these Asian sides didn't do too badly. Again, we were experimenting with certain things, certain duos, but here we have another goal from a corner, and we got the win in the end. We got over the line in the end, but I do kind of think we are going to struggle to score goals in the Premier League this season. So come January, I do feel like one of the first things on our shopping list is going to be to perhaps replace Glenn Murray with someone a little bit more energetic, someone who is a little bit more technical. Now, we still have Izquierdo, who was injured throughout pre-season, and even though on paper he's a winger, he can also play up front, and I think up front he can be really, really powerful coming off the bench. So the way tactically we're set up is to try and not concede goals, obviously playing the Pulis way, and hit teams on the break and hit them direct, as we've seen so far. So saving his pace and energy for the end of games, especially when he'll have someone like a Tom Ahmed who can win the ball in the air alongside him. It's kind of that Crouch Defoe-ish partnership. The only difference is we don't want to play with that starting games. We want to try and exploit tied defenders late on in a game. So yeah, that explains that. But generally speaking, we're winning games, even when we're not playing well, which is always a good sign. And finally, going into our last game of pre-season, pretty much in terms of our tactical approach, settled in on what we're going to be playing against Chelsea or moving forth in the Premier League with. Suttner wins a ball, Murray wins a ball in the air, and Hamed, with a phenomenal strike, scores on the break. And of course we scored a second one as well. But looking at the left hand side straight away, we can see we were incredibly defensively resilient. We dominated the game from start to finish, and I believe a massive factor in performances improving. There we go, nice direct play, one striker into the other, ball into the box from out wide, is because players are starting to reach that point where the dynamics are improving, and I was training teamwork and team cohesion between the players as well. So I do have a funny feeling this is going to be one of them football managers where tactics do take a bit of time to settle in at the start of a season. And again, it is all visual from here, and I don't know how much of a part these things play in performances, but for me, these kind of elements, on top of the fact that morale used to play a bit, I wouldn't say a massive, but a slightly small role in older versions of Football Manager, where if you had players that were slightly angry with you, they might not perform as well as they could have, or at least that's what I found. I don't know if it was a placebo effect, but now they've brought these into the equation, I don't know how that's going to affect things, but that's why we're playing a beta save. It's to learn about the game and get a rough idea of how it's evolving, right? So, and if you think about it, I think it is a good feature, because even though you think of professional footballers, it shouldn't really matter who they're playing with, whether you like it or not. If a right back and right winger are playing week in, week out with each other, like 70 minutes plus week in, week out, the understanding between them is going to be significantly better than the understanding between that very same right back and the random winger that comes off the bench, right? So, yeah, new features make sense. We've just got to try and get used to it and try and suss out the best way to tackle it. But on that note, that's all of our pre-season results. So positively, not really lost any games, but we are probably going to lose against Chelsea in the next episode. Let's take a look at some of our tactical changes. For those of you guys who watched the second episode, looking at this straight away, we'll be able to identify quite a few of the changes. Again, I don't think we need to take too long with this, because a lot of the changes aren't massive. Even though some of you might think they are, I don't think they are. I think conceptually a lot is very, very similar. I think the biggest change overall in terms of how the team will play and what affects the team is probably the mentality. But that's also why we have 3 different tactics, right? To try and find a good balance with the mentality. And I know a lot of people are going to be looking at this right now and thinking, what on earth are you doing with an overload mentality? Do not tell me you're going to go into the game against Chelsea with an overload mentality. Might do. So before I kind of go into individual changes, I think it's important to talk about the overall team instruction and mentality and team shape changes that the tactic has underseen, and the different versions of it throughout pre-season. And I'll explain why I made the changes I did, because the overall team mentality changes and team shape changes have really dictated individual player changes more than anything, and I'll explain why. So obviously, when I created the tactic in the second video, I'd not played much FM18, and it's great to hear that some people have had success with its state then, but I personally believe this mimics the Pulis way a little bit better. I took some time out and started a Blackburn save. Now, people watching this may have watched my Blackburn save last year and will know that I'm a Blackburn fan, and every year I kind of always do a Blackburn save, a quick one for fun, right? I just like to play as Blackburn, it's my team and whatnot. And we were 2-0 down in one game, and I was a bit frustrated, went overload, and in a matter of 25 minutes we turned it around and won 3-2. Now you might think, yeah, well, Blackburn were kind of expected to walk League One going into this season, but it was actually in the Cup against a Championship side, so make of that what you will. So that kind of intrigued me, made me think, what was it about the overload mentality that helped us score 3 goals? And the thing was that just watching the style of play and how the style of play changed, because in terms of how I like to play as a manager, and again, people who've watched my saves previously will know I like counter-attacking football. To be fully honest, the last time I kind of saw blitzish style, fast sweeping attacks the same way I did watching that Blackburn team against that Championship side on an overload mentality was probably FM13. So it really did get me thinking whether or not I can replicate this going forward with my Stoke approach. Now, the reason why I feel like it would have been a good idea to try that out was because, like I said, a Stoke approach or a Pulis approach is all about turning defence to attack. And as soon as you get an opportunity to turn defence into attack, you've got to blitz and give your all. The intensity has got to be 110%, because you might not get another chance to counter-attack the opposition within the next 10 minutes, right? And you only get 9 sets of 10 minutes in a game. So I just decided to give it a go and to make tweaks here and there to try and even it out, because obviously overload is a very intense, very attacking mentality. So the approach with it was to see whether or not I could maintain an overload mentality, which would give me that blitzish, sweep-in, fast-paced style attack in the final third or in the opposition half upon transition, but to also try and remain as solid at the back as possible, whilst also adhering to the Tony Pulis way of play. So going to the overload mentality and then decreasing the mentality of our fullbacks meant that our fullbacks didn't really get affected too much, nor our defence or goalkeeper, by the overload mentality. Because when we initially made our tactic, we had fullbacks on automatic, and fullbacks on automatic with a overload mentality would have basically put them on attack, which would have left us very, very exposed in the open. As well, another issue I found with playing two DLPs as defensive midfielders was that we simply weren't winning the ball back enough in midfield. And with the go route one option and the urgency to play as fast as possible, even though on paper ball winning midfielders try to play simple passes, the go route one option actually seemed to encourage ball winning midfielders when they can to try and hoof a ball forwards towards the two attackers and turn defence into attack, while simultaneously having him as a ball winning midfielder rather on defend rather than a deep lying playmaker kind of helped us solidify the defence a little bit more by having that extra defensive body on the pitch, and also result in him as an individual player not really being affected by the overload mentality. And going to a structured team shape helped that as well. The reason for this is because a structured team shape kind of promotes more modularity. By using a structured team shape and utilising the right shouts on individual players, we were still able to a lot of the time have two banks of four, and the defensive forwards still helping out defensively off the ball, while simultaneously the structured team shape would kind of add more modularity to the defenders and defensive midfielders who are on a defensive duty anyways. So naturally that would mean that they would look to get involved in attacks a lot less, which again, despite the overload mentality, seemed to still give us some defensive stability. So you think about an overload mentality, you think, bloody hell, all your players push forward. But we somehow actually, by making these tweaks and putting so much emphasis on defensive play for them, kind of like the back five players, it seemed to nullify the overload effect on them. Whilst if you look at the two strikers and the three midfielders behind them, the overload mentality still affected them. So because the formation on the right hand side is always your off the ball formation in Football Manager, and because they fixed wingers defensively this year, you still get defensive output coming from the wingers, which is good despite the overload mentality. So it's not like they end up pushing forwards and kind of playing like AMLs and AMRs and don't help defensively whatsoever because of an overload mentality. None whatsoever. However, as soon as you win that ball back and the ball goes into the wide areas, because those front players are playing with an overload mentality where they want to get the ball forward as fast as possible, that just created the awesome Pulis-esque style of play that I've come into this looking for. So yeah, so that's the defensive fullback change explained. We've gone to a sweeper keeper simply because Begovic, I think, was more of a sweeper keeper. The main two changes, obviously, are going to be what we've done to the two deep line playmakers. I found that the two deep line playmakers just didn't have enough bite in the tackle, so they weren't helping out enough defensively, and simultaneously they weren't helping out enough offensively because they were kind of defensive midfielders. Which is why I've already explained the ball-winning midfielder and why we've gone for him. But like I said, because we're going route one, because we're on an overload mentality still and trying to get the ball forward, he's actually a lot more creative than a bog-standard ball-winning midfielder. And we've actually opted to use one of the new roles. And I'll admit, I'm never a fan of new roles, but I've been quite impressed with this new role. And it's actually called the Carroll Arrow. And the way it's described is very similar to a box-to-box midfielder, but instead of shuttling between the boxes, you kind of shuttle between the lines of the midfield. So it's almost like a roaming playmaker, but a kind of roaming playmaker that kind of works a little bit harder. Or at least that's how I've understood it, kind of like your Charlie Adam style of player. You just want him floating around in the midfield area, as it explains, between the lines and playing balls forwards. But simultaneously, because he's not a box-to-box, he's not going to be pushing too forward and then leaving Stevens in midfield on his own, if that makes sense. So I really found that using the Carrillo role, it was like a slightly toned down box-to-box midfielder. It was quite nice, and it's been working quite well so far, I think. And again, the ball-winning midfielder, I know we talked about Steven Nzonzi and him being more like a deep-line playmaker, but like I said, the deep-line playmaker on defence, I just did not see enough legwork from that player as an individual, enough battle from that role as an individual to merit him being that role. And the ball-winning midfielder for me, especially for a counter-attacking tactic, has actually been a lot more effective. Defensively, he's been winning the ball back a lot more in midfield, But again, because of our instructions, and once you actually bring in a slightly more technical player, like a Steven Zonzi-esque type of player, he won't be scared to actually try and pass the ball, even though he is a ball-winning midfielder. So that's really the long-term vision of that role. Next up, we have our wingers, which are really unchanged. Obviously, we've changed some player instructions on them, which we'll take a look at in a second. But that's kind of expected with tweaking, because obviously in the second episode, we didn't put any instructions on them whatsoever. And two of the main changes as well. Tom Hamed in the second episode was a defensive forward on defend. I just kind of found that he wasn't getting in the box enough, so naturally, put him on support. And to be fair, the main difference between the defensive forward on defend and support, bar his own individual mentality, which affects, how often he gets into the box and stuff, was the closing down. And I'd already kind of I had him on defend, but told him to close down more. But then when you put him on support, the main thing that changes, I think, off the top of my head, is his closing down. So it just seemed like a no-brainer. Get him in the box more and get him to carry on closing down. So it made a lot more sense. And because he plays slightly deeper as well, it makes a lot of nice runs forwards and plays the ball out wide, kind of like what Jonathan Walters used to do. Quite happy with it. And then next up we had Glenn Murray. Now, for me, the target man kind of role seems a lot more effective than previous versions of FM, but I still kind of felt like with the target man there, it was a very specialist role. Now you think about the complete forward role, and you think, wow, complete forward role. Obviously part of the complete forward role is to be able to play like a target man, but I kind of found that when you're a target man, a lot of the time, when balls come to you, naturally, they are aerial balls, and I think that's great. When you've got a Peter Crouch in his prime up front, or a James Beattie, or a Ricardo Fuller, or in real life's case, someone like a Lukaku or a Harry Kane, someone who genuinely can and has the ability to win most balls in the air and really well and truly be a proper type target man. In fact, we might sign Andy Carroll in January if we still want to go down that route. But with Glenn Murray, he's a decent target man, but against most Premier League defenders, he just isn't physical enough to constantly compete in the air. So I found that going for a complete forward kind of meant he was still open to play as a target man, but it reduced the number of times the ball would be delivered to him aerially, and he'd often receive the ball a little bit more on the floor, which suited him a lot more. It's also worth mentioning as well, the Carroll Arrow. One of the main things we were lacking when we played with two defensive midfielders, like I said, because they were too far back, what would happen a lot of the time was direct ball would go forward and your two strikers would win the ball in the air, and you need someone to pick up the second ball. And because our two central defensive players were so far back, we would always lose the second ball in midfield, which would give the ball back to the opposition. So now playing that Carroll Arrow on support further up the pitch kind of means that when he feels like it, when it's possible, he will surge forwards a little bit more and try and compete for the second ball at least. And because he's the more creative player, when he does win that second ball, which happens relatively often, because one of our two strikers has managed to win it in the air or to play it back or down and whatnot from a direct ball forwards, because he's more creative, it then means he can try and play it out wide and set up a cross and whatnot. So that also is a logical aspect to it that I forgot to discuss. And I just want to say as well, those of you guys that watched like my Zidane tactical recreation last year, that mentality was defensive. And you think about Real Madrid under Zidane, in terms of mentality, they weren't defensive whatsoever. But the main reason why we went defensive was because we had so many players on attacking roles to get the best out of them, that to remain solid at the back, we had to play with a defensive mentality. And I think it's very important that when you look at things like this, or at least how I create tactics on Football Manager, it isn't based on what the text says, because it is never how the text says it. There's just too many factors that all get mixed up together in a mixing pot at once, which is where the mixing pot is your tactic, that end up affecting each other. So it's never as clear cut as what is written down in front of you. You've got to go based off performances and what you see when watching your team. So yes, overload seems a bit strange, but as we saw in pre-season, it didn't do too badly. Now, taking a look at our few variations, we have an overload variation, which is going to be our main approach to the game. We have a defensive variation, and the defensive variation will be for the first 5 and last 5 minutes of each half. And if we score a goal, we'll also go defensive for 5 minutes, simply because it's been something I've done for years on Football Manager, and I hate conceding 5 minutes into a game or just before half time, for example. And I also find that sometimes you are at your most weakest when you've scored a goal. So when you are an underdog like this, it's something we used to do in my FM17 Blackburn save, when we played a 4-4-2 as well, for obvious reasons. Defensive option, you know, in them kinds of scenarios, just to solidify yourself a little bit. And then the Pulis park the bus. You're probably looking at this and thinking, park the bus with an overload mentality. Jesus Christ. All it is the regular tactic with the wingers toned down to support. And some of the team instructions have changed as well. So if you take a look at the team instructions that have changed, we've simply turned on get stuck in, using tighter marking, and we've dropped our defensive line. I think that's it pretty much, yeah. So again, that's the kind of tactic that we'd probably employ when we're 2-0 up, for example, or 2-1 up going into the last 10 minutes of the game, where we don't want to go too negative and we don't want to change too much around, but we just want to make slight tweaks that really kind of just makes us a little bit harder in the tackle, a little bit more difficult to break down, and ensures we play a little bit safer. So comparing new team instructions with old team instructions, again, you've got to bear in mind that team instructions are relative to their mentality. So a slightly deeper defensive line on an overload mentality is really more like a normal or deeper defensive line on a standard mentality. That's why, even though it says slightly deeper, if I went to defensive, as you can see, slightly deeper on defensive is a lot deeper than slightly deeper on overload. Or a normal tempo on overload is like uber high tempo in standard. So even though it says normal, we are going to be attacking with pace, trust me. And a lot of these team instructions are simply different because our mentality has changed, but in reality, they're roughly the same as what we had in episode 2. I'd say the main changes are maybe width. We're a little bit wider now, and defensively, because we are now playing with a flat back four, whilst before we were playing with fullbacks on automatic. We can take a little bit more of a risk, and it kind of promotes the wide play. Another thing we changed as well was our closing down. So we were on closing down less because we wanted to try and keep 2 flat banks of 4 and stay as narrow and difficult to break down as possible. But I just did not find the match engine responded to it well whatsoever. And a lot of the time it just resulted in us just not creating enough attacking opportunities because we weren't winning the ball back enough, because players were willing to play with a very low intensity and just simply not close down the opposition. So as you can see, our closing down is now sometimes. So we're not doing gegenpressing or anything mad like that. We've just upped it a little bit, you know, which is just a very simple tweak to try and win the ball back more in midfield. It's nothing serious. And we've turned on get stuck in. Another change we made as well, we're no longer looking to exploit both flanks, which I think makes sense now, because exploiting the flanks for me is still going to force the fullbacks to get involved, which isn't what we want. So we're going to pump the ball into the box. And again, results in very direct play, but given that we've got 2 very physical strikers up front, I expect them to be able to deal with it. And the fact of the matter is, transitioning from defence to attack, your wingers run faster without the ball than they do with the ball, if you catch where I'm coming from. So I found that if we do pump the ball into the box, and we can win the ball going route 1, the wingers won't be far too behind the strikers and ready, you know, to run out wide and pick up the ball and whip the ball in should they be required. I just found it worked a lot better than trying to exploit the flanks. Obviously, passing directness is no longer going direct. We're going route 1. And even though going direct was okay, it just wasn't as direct as a Pulis team. And I did mention this as well in episode 2, that we could end up changing to go route 1. But new match engine and whatnot, I'd not used the match engine. We had to wait and see how our instructions would really affect things. And I've turned on run at defence as well, just try and get the wingers to run more and utilise their pace more. That's it really. In terms of individual changes, so our wingers are now looking to close down more, tackle harder and mark tighter. Tackling harder and closing down a little bit more is honestly just helping us win that ball back a little bit better. And because we have sometimes closing down on the team instruction, it doesn't end up being ridiculous levels of closing down. And marking tighter just ensures they stick tighter to any opposition players and help out the fullbacks a lot more, because they are on an attacking mentality. Our team mentality is overload, and just using marking tighter just ensures that they do fall back and help defend that little bit better. So obviously before, our 2 DLPs just had tackle harder on them. Now our ball winning midfielder is told to shoot less often, which we kind of discussed earlier on in the video, where we had too many shots from outside the box happening. and to mark tighter. As for the Carrillo, again, shooting less often, tackling harder, marking tighter. It's very, very important that we mark opposition players in the middle of the park as tight as possible and try and protect the two centre-backs as much as possible as well. But in terms of closing down, our ball-winning midfielder isn't on support, he's on defence to make sure he only closes down in our kind of deep area of our half. Because if I put him on support, he'll go missing and it'll expose the defence. And the other main reason why our Carrillo is told to mark tighter and not necessarily close down more is again so he doesn't go missing. So we end up with this really tight, nice unit in the middle of the park, which I'm quite happy with as well. The Carrillo, or Carrilero, however the hell you say it, will be slightly further up the pitch. So sometimes it'll kind of look like a 4-1-2-1-2, but you expect that with a slightly more adventurous second central midfielder, and that's not really too different to how Pulis used to play at Stoke anyways. In terms of our centre-backs, we're no longer telling them to mark tighter or tackle harder. Plus Shane Duffy kind of has the likes to mark tighter PPM anyways on him, so telling him to mark tighter on top of that is probably not a good idea, and I found that it wasn't a good idea. As for our defensive fullbacks, again, not very different, except they're no longer kind of being told to cross aim towards a target man because we no longer have a target man, so I don't really see the point in that. They're not being told to tackle harder because we are getting stuck in now. So tackle harder is something I turn off on individual players when I tell the team as a whole to get stuck in, because having the two on can result in far too many cards being picked up, which is why as soon as Stevens or whoever's playing the ball winning midfielder in defence, defensive midfield, gets a yellow card, you got to tell them to calm down. And obviously I tell the DFBs to sit narrower as well, because let's be honest, just think about how narrow Pulis' fullbacks were. It was essentially 4 centre-backs rather than 2 centre-backs and 4 fullbacks. And that's it really in terms of the changes. You know, we've not really seen anything too significant. So, on that note, that is going to be it for this episode. No idea how long this episode has actually ended up being, but I kind of promise that after this episode we will actually play a game. We'll stop having these long episodes, but you know, it's just something we kind of have to deal with. And I know some people are going to be looking at it and thinking, what on earth are you doing playing with a overload mentality? What on earth are you doing? I go off what seems to work well and play the right style of football. Now, it may not work well in the Premier League, but playing this way in pre-season, watching games on comprehensive was what reproduced the best Pulis style of hoofball, or Pulis ball as some people call it. So I've got to be loyal to it, I've got to stick with it, and I've got to stick with my gut instinct. And it's a beta match engine, it's a new Football Manager game, and we've got nothing to lose. I'm intrigued. And the worst case scenario is we lose a few games, tweak it again, and get sacked. And if we do get sacked, then we can at least walk away from this and say, you know what, we've learned a lot about the FM18 match engine. Because that's why you do a beta save. But on that note, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, let me know in the comments what you think about some of these changes. I know not everyone's going to like them, but I'm really intrigued in actually hearing your opinions. I'm also very intrigued in hearing your opinions about what you guys think about the new dynamics feature and what you guys think about the new scouting feature as well. I mean, when I initially saw the scouting feature, I was like, whoa, what? Also, just remembered now, so transfers, just before we go, players I tried to bring in on trials. So I brought Yusuf Malumbu in on a trial. Looks like a decent player. I was kind of thinking he's more of a ball-winning midfielder than Dale Stephens is, but my gut feeling just said no. Vucinic as well, we discussed. Very, very nice attributes. Honestly, like playing up front or even playing on the right-hand side for us, training him as a right midfielder, it could have made such a difference for us. But unfortunately, can't get a work permit for him. And we also brought in Emir Spahic, 36-year-old on trial. Now, he's got some decent stats, but we've got a lot of centre-backs at the club, so I don't really feel like I need him. Other players we also brought in, we actually brought in a lot of staff, and that was mainly because the existing staff at the club was absolutely dreadful, whilst now we kind of have some of the best staff in the Premier League, so much so that we have the best defence setup in the Premier League. So that tells you a lot about what I'm trying to build here. Could be a little bit better in terms of fitness and whatnot, but generally speaking, we're looking a lot healthier than we did beforehand. So if we take a look at our previous goalkeeping coach, he had 9 distribution, 9 handling, and 9 shot stopping, which to be honest is dreadful for Premier League standard of goalkeeping coaching. We had Thomas Barnden, who was a fitness coach with a fitness attribute of 10, which again was dreadful. And Josh Hook is a sports scientist who wasn't really special either. So first signing we brought in was Paul McGuinness, and straight away you see this guy, ex-Man United coach, kind of a no-brainer to bring him in. Wanted a new challenge. 19 defending, 18 technical, 16 mental, which means he can help out on shooting drills in training, and he can also help out with defending as well. Next up, Ray Wilkins, a bit of a Chelsea legend. 15 defending, 11 technical, you know, experienced as well, ex-manager, ex-assistant manager. He's been round the block as Ray Wilkins, and it just seemed like a good, experienced guy to bring in to, you know, try and help us keep this club in the Premier League. Next up, Alan Russell, brought in as another coach. We brought in 2 very strong defensive mind coaches, so we need to bring in some decent attacking coaches to level it out. 15 attacking, 15 technical. Attacking and technical are going to be very important attributes for us to train this season, because we're not going to have much chances on playing on the counter-attack. But as Leicester showed, it's not about quantity, it's about quality, right? So if we can get the best as possible out of Glenn Murray and Tom Ahmed from now until January, and one of them can be replaced, happy days. Up next, Darren Robinson, brought in as fitness coach, 14 fitness, so not a massive improvement from our previous fitness coach, but what I liked about him was he was alright in terms of his other attributes as well. Now, unfortunately, it turns out that as a fitness coach, he can't actually help with anything but fitness, which was kind of disappointing, but 14 fitness is still an improvement from what we previously had, and we had to bring in a fitness coach anyways. Next up, Juan Salvans, I think that's how you pronounce it. 14 attacking, 14 defending, 14 mental, 12 tactical, 14 technical. This guy, Spanish, he's learning English somewhere now apparently, and he just seemed like a very good coach. Decent across the board, can help out in loads of different areas, and yeah. And last but not least is Norwegian sports scientist. She's called Greta Homstol, I think that's how you pronounce it, and she's got 16 sports science, which says a lot about her sports science ability. And, you know, a lot of people, I think, on Football Manager underestimate how effective having decent staff is. At the end of the day, your players are training week in, week out with these lot, so the higher their stats, the more effective training is going to be building up to match day. But on that note, once again, if you like the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Can't wait to actually kick off against Chelsea. I'm going to go to bed. Good night.